Hello, it's Wiggly Podcast number 2, and I'm joined here by Richard once again. Hi, Rich.
Oh, hello, you alright?
Yep, we've got lots this week to talk about, Rich. And we've got news from behind the scenes at Wiggly's, what's been going on. You're going to talk about hedgehogs.
Yes, that's right.
We've got Farmer Phil coming in. You've been reading a book, I think.
I have. Wildlife Ponds by Jenny Steele.
Great. We've got Alison popping in. Alison grows our plants. She's going to pop in with Plant of the Week. And then we've got Monty's Wormcast. So lots to get on with. What's been happening this week at Wiggly's then? Well, I know you've been out and about, haven't you?
I have. Last week at Wiggly's we did our schools project in a local school in Hereford where I worked with approximately 240 children to recreate an existing wildlife area that had been neglected slightly. The trees had got too large and the pond had got a huge leak in it and whatnot. So we replaced the pond and made some fantastic seating out of some old silver birch that was there and made some log piles and put some slabs down and compost heaps. All sorts of really neat things. We also made some bug bottles. I got the kids to bring in plastic bottles.
Yeah.
And on site there were lots of teasels growing and cow parsley. So we cut the stems and we stuffed the bottles full of the stems to make fantastic little bug bottles, which we've kind of taped to downpipes across the school grounds.
Fantastic.
Really
You had the fire
nice
brigade in,
opportunity.
didn't you?
Yeah, the fire brigade came in and filled the pond.
Oh, that's what it was.
Saved the school a few quid, because of course they're on metered water. So I think that's the schools often quite like doing that, and the fire brigades are usually fairly flexible, so they'll often pop in and fill the pond up in minutes. Yeah, yeah.
From my end, what have I been up to? Well, we went to an awards ceremony.
That's right.
Yeah, very nice. At the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, we actually won the award, which was the award for the British Small Business Champion for the Central Region, which means that we'll be going on through to the final.
It's quite an achievement, isn't it, really?
Well, I think it's,
no need for false modesty, no?
No false modesty. We must be on the right track, mustn't we?
Yeah,
That must be it. But I don't think you can take these things too seriously. But even so, it was a very nice evening with a good tea party. And the prize was presented by Jonathan Davis, who's a Welsh rugby player, and now he's a TV commentator. And honestly, this is what happened. He's on the table waiting for his wine to come, and the waitress comes and she says to him, what would he like, blah, blah, and he has a chat, and he says to her, what's the vegetarian? And she truly said back to him, it's a person who doesn't eat meat, sir. Corker. Anyway, I got to kiss him, which was nice. And,
just a job.
There were 6 of us who went, and so now off we go to London, and there's an even better tea party because it's at Claridge's.
Wow. And
if Wiggly Wigglers wins this event, we get a tailor-made trip to New York.
Oh.
So that's just for me, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
And also, you did a talk, didn't you?
I did a talk. You escaped, didn't you?
I did.
You missed out that particular opportunity. I did a talk to a local Rotary Club in Ledbury about gardening for wildlife. I think they were all sort of anticipating a talk specifically about worms, but I went into kind of more detail and talked about how important it was to garden for wildlife, not just creating ponds, wildflower habitats, but also growing vegetables, not using pesticides and chemicals to control caterpillars and aphids and whatnot.
Did they use pesticides?
Yeah, I think most of it was interesting. So I asked how many people, because I've been working in school, so I asked everybody to put their hands up, through the whole process.
It's gone to your head, hasn't it?
Yeah. I asked how many people used pesticides. Pretty much everyone in the room that was into their gardening used pesticides. So obviously my work was cut out.
They all had dead slugs and dead worms.
They did. Dead slugs, dead worms, dead hedgehogs, I think. Yeah, nice rose blooms, but nothing else in the garden.
That's a good challenge for you, though, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just trying to get across the message that you can often get as much pleasure, if not more pleasure, from observing ladybird larvae feeding on the aphids on your rosebuds, and perhaps not having that perfect rosebud. It's a small price to pay. It's just a little compromise from being able to look at the fantastic array of invertebrate life that you have on your plants if you don't use chemical pesticides.
And you can't have preached to them very much, because they wrote in as an email to say how much they'd enjoyed the talk, and hoped that we'd come again. So
No,
they
it can't have been
enjoyed it
too
as
bad.
well.
I can't have
Yeah.
intimidated them too much.
Anyway, we've got to move on. What I want to talk about this week is hedgehogs.
Hedgehogs, yeah.
It's the time of year that hedgehogs spring to mind, isn't it? You know, time of year when they get stuck under bonfires that you're building and they're hibernating and everything's action for hedgehogs.
Quite possibly. Interesting enough, I've been asked several questions about hedgehogs recently. How do we provide a nice place for them to hibernate in the garden? How do we attract them into the garden to make sure they're there to feed on our slugs and whatnot?
So what do we do then to attract hedgehogs or give them shelter?
There are various ways and means. Hedgehogs will often hibernate underneath your garden shed, or perhaps in a compost heap, but you can provide habitats for them by perhaps making a small box for them to hibernate in. What they do naturally is they'll hibernate, say for instance under the butt of a hedge, and they'll harvest lots of leaves, dry leaves, and they'll make a nest and they'll go in there, and that's where they'll hibernate. Apparently what they do as well throughout the course of the year, they will change their bedding material, so they won't sleep right through. They'll wake up at points and change their nesting material.
Why do they do that then?
I don't know. It might be something to do with their excreting, and then perhaps their nesting material becomes damp.
Ooing.
I'm not sure. Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's my take on it. It might not be the case, but the chances are it's also because of the weather. If they're subject to persistent rain, for instance, then their bedding material might be breaking down, so they might want warmer, better, stronger cover, so they'll change it according to the state that it's in.
And so their eating pattern, what do they...
Well, they feed right through. They don't know, as people assume that hedgehogs kind of hibernate through the winter. Well, they do hibernate through the winter, but sometimes they won't hibernate until December. In most cases it's November, but with our climate changing in the way it is, and if there's food available until until the last knock-ins of the year, and they're able to feast on various grubs and berries and whatnot, then they won't hibernate right until the end of the year.
And they're disasters for hedgehogs. There's been a lot of press about, rescuing hedgehogs and rehoming hedgehogs from islands. Are they doing well, or are they
I think they're not. Yeah, in lots of cases, small British mammals, they're not doing particularly well, but it's mostly as a consequence of loss of habitat. Again, the whole kind of intensive agriculture thing, building development, and roads have a major impact on hedgehog populations.
Or cars even.
Cars, yeah, big time. Yeah.
I know that slug pellets have been a complete disaster for hedgehogs, haven't they?
They're a total disaster. I mean, what happens is people might see hedgehogs in their garden after they put slug pellets down, but the toxins build up in their body over time.
Right.
So you might end up with a situation where the hedgehog will be feeding on slugs that have ingested some of the slug pellets, and then the toxins build up, so they might be all right for 12 months, and then those toxins build up to such an extent they'll die much later on.
And also the way that we used to make ponds, you haven't got a really shallow way out.
Yeah.
These days, if you make a wildlife pond, you generally have very shallow edges, don't you? But it used to be that concrete ponds were a disaster for hedgehogs.
Yeah, they'll bundle in. They can swim. They're quite good swimmers, and they're reasonable climbers as well, hedgehogs. But of course, if there's a steep-sided pond they can't get out of, then there's no hope at all. Interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, I had a garden pond at home. And I went out, it was early spring, it was still pretty cold, and I went out in the morning to, I think, probably get some wood in for the fire or something, and I looked across the pond, and there were 2 hedgehogs in the pond on a small island. But they were slightly separated from one another.
This is a wind-up.
No, this is right. This is right.
True, right.
And there was lots of grunting and snorting going on, really kind of vocal. And I looked at them for ages. I thought, what are those two doing there? But they'd obviously been in the water as well, and they'd gone in the pond and clambered out of the pond. And it was gladiators. But what it must have been is that over amorous male.
Yeah.
He's had a long winter. He's just come out of hibernation. He's found a mate. And she's thinking, oh my God, I've got to get away from this guy. And they both ended up in the pond. And they were both in the pond. They were both, kind of cold and snorting and stuff. I caught them both and put them and warmed them up. Gave them a bit of food. Yeah, separately, because I wasn't sure whether, But I let them go later on in the same garden, so whether he caught up with her again, I don't know. Quite possibly. But obviously that pond was created with hedgehogs in mind, to make sure that they can get out of the pond if they fall in there.
Oh, I thought you meant it was created with hedgehogs in mind who happened to fall in, that happened to have 2 islands.
No, so interestingly enough, that one of the most important criteria in creating a pond is to make sure that things can get out of it as well as get in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. Any other
hedgehog stories.
antics
Well,
that
it's
have
interesting.
happened to you?
There
There can't be another one.
we used to live in a garden that was loads and loads of hedgehogs, and I've got one or two dogs. The one's completely loopy, and
What sort of dog?
George Terriers they are. But he's a real George in the jungle, this terrier. So he'll go out. He goes out at night, goes running around the garden barking and stuff. A couple of times he'd come back in, his mouth was all covered in blood. Just it's a white terrier. His whole gums are bleeding. I thought, what on earth have you been doing? So I went out and had a look, and there's a kind of hedgehog just trundling along the garden, and what the dog had been doing is trying to bite the hedgehog. But of course, because they've got their fantastic prickles and they curl up into a ball, the dog was biting at it and getting all these prickles in his mouth as well. So he's kind of licking his gums for ages, and the hedgehog just ambling off, thinking, "Oh, I wonder what that was all about."
Why have they? How did they end up having those?
Well, that's obviously a good example of why they've got that kind of armoury like that, is to protect themselves. But interestingly enough, one of their main predators in the wild are badgers. They can just flip a hedgehog over, and they will they'll kill a hedgehog by trying to prise them apart and then biting their undercarriage. So a bit unfortunate for hedgehogs, and they're supposed to be very good to eat. There's all sorts of there's
you can't
people
eat them,
traditionally old English people used to bake them in mud, and if you kind of bake them, wrap them in clay and bake them in mud, then when you crack open the muddy shell, all the prickles come off and the skin comes off in the mud shell, so you end up with this baked animal.
Which brings me on to my other thing, which is the best way of conservation is to eat it, because if you eat it, you've got a demand for it.
Absolutely. Perhaps we start hedgehog farming.
I don't think we should eat a hedgehog. I really don't. I think it might put the listener off.
No, that's right. They're beautiful animals to have. They're a real benefit to the natural gardener because they are so useful at keeping pests down. Not only do they look good, there are instances, like you mentioned, the Isle of Lewis earlier on. There are instances where hedgehogs, eat ground nesting birds' eggs, and in that instance, the population of hedgehogs had grown to such an extent that they were really affecting the population of dunlins' eggs. I think it's probably something like that. Or plovers' eggs.
So, they haven't got any predators up there.
No predators, no cars, no roads, plenty of habitat.
All they need is somebody to eat them. Then
they need predators. Yeah, they need predators to check them, but not quite to the extent that they've got them in mainland UK at the moment.
And so, if somebody finds a hedgehog in their garden, what should they do and what shouldn't they do?
They definitely shouldn't use slug pellets.
Nope.
And only natural sources of milk isn't good. Apparently it gives them diarrhea.
Yeah.
Cat food is supposed to be okay.
Yeah.
Though it's quite nice if you want to try and attract them. Do they really?
Yeah.
Well, mealworms, of course, are so nutritious, aren't they? So fatty and full of protein. Really a kind of natural source of food.
And water. Water's
good. Yeah, they do drink. But again, you see, they'll get a lot of water from their food. Who do you imagine slugs have got to be some sort of content of?
Juicy, Great. That's lovely. Next week we'll be talking about feeding birds. It's coming up to the RSPB Feed the Birds Day, so we'll be chatting about what foods, when, why, and all about that. It's that time of the week again, Rich. It's Farmer Phil's report.
Excellent.
Well, this week we've continued planting our winter crops. We've had a good week. It's been interesting in as much that, as I mentioned last week, we've seen various wildlife around the place. I've got the barn owls hunting in the periphery of the lights at night, which is great to watch. They're like ghosts. And obviously they're after the mice that we plough up or whatever. It'd be interesting to know, and I don't know the answer to this, how territorial they are and how big their territories are. Because I don't know whether I'm looking at 2, 4 or 6 barn owls. It just depends on how far we think they go.
It will be interesting to find out.
Well, perhaps our listeners can email in and let us know how far barn owls go.
Yeah.
And we've...
Anyway, I thought you'd been planting up David Beckham's new football pitch.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to tell you that potentially David Beckham's new football pitch is more than planted. It's growing and coming up.
Excellent.
But yes,
why is it David Beckham?
We grow amenity ryegrass, which is basically the ryegrass that you'd use to plant football pitches. And since the variety that we grow is top of the list, it tends to get sold to the main stadiums around the country, football, cricket and so on. And therefore it's entirely possible that Mr. Beckham and his colleagues get to play on some of our grass seed at some point.
Right.
It sounds a little far-fetched. Have you got any proof of this, Phil?
Absolutely. Our grass seed, off the top of my head, was used at Southampton's stadium.
Hardly First Division, is it?
And the Millennium Stadium.
Anywhere else that your grass seed is planted?
A variety that we grew until a couple of years ago is used on the centre court at Wimbledon.
Anything else you want to tell us about?
A trait that we've noticed this year, in terms of the fallow deer that we have on the farm, we normally only see the females and youngsters at this end of the farm. But in the last fortnight, I've seen at least half a dozen young stags or bucks at this end of the farm, which is unusual. But I don't think there's anything untoward going on. But it's nice to see them, and just going dusk when they're stood there with their antlers, they're quite impressive beasts. I don't think I'd want to argue with one anyway.
Fantastic animals, aren't they? We're quite lucky in some respects to have fallows in Herefordshire. People often say they're not indigenous to Herefordshire, they shouldn't be here, we should have roes and whatnot instead, and red deer. But of course, the reality is that we wouldn't have red deer now here anyway. And the chances are you might not have roes in your area. So
we have got a pair of roe that I know of, and we have seen one or two of the little species that I can't remember. Muntjacs, yes. We've got a few muntjacs about as well, but they're very shy. You don't see them very often. But the roes are quite funny because, being a rather sturdier deer, they don't look as if they can run very fast. And Toast can't resist chasing them if she sees them. But there's not a hope in hell of her catching them, and it's very funny watching her try.
Deer will dance as well sometimes, won't they? If they're being chased by something that they know that they can run away from easily, they sort of dance in front of it just to make it look like a fool.
They are amazing things in terms of what they can jump. They make it look entirely effortless how they do it. They will clear a fence by feet without looking to expend any energy at all. It's amazing.
It is amazing, and yet, by contrast, sometimes they get hung up in barbed wire fences, don't they? Yeah.
Having watched them, I think that happens when they're not frightened. Yeah. They sort of sidle up to the fence and think they're just going to hop over it and don't try particularly, and then get themselves entangled in it. And I've watched them do it and had to go and disentangle them. Yeah. And whereas if something spooks them and they set out to jump it properly, they clear it by feet.
No problem at all.
What do they eat?
Well, they graze, I think, in much the same way as sheep.
Don't you mind them grazing in the fields then?
If I was feeling churlish, I probably would mind them, but they're nice to look at and they're almost impossible to stop, so that deer fencing is very expensive stuff. It's cheaper to let them have the run of the place. We like the look of them, and it's not a great hardship.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. We'll wind it up there.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thank you,
next
Phil.
week.
Cheers, nice to see you.
Book review this week is Wildlife Ponds by Jenny Steele. Very small book, very concise book. Few pages, few pictures on really how to make your own wildlife pond. Would you say that was fair, Rich?
Yeah, it's a nice little book. It is, like you say, very concise. It's a practical little handbook, and it really kind of gives the beginner an insight into creating a wildlife pond.
Yeah, I think it's $3.75, and there's sort of 34 pages. Goes into quite a bit of detail in terms of plants. What did you think of it?
It's a nice little tool to have before you create the pond. In fact, it might be, if people are seriously thinking about creating a pond and they haven't got enough information at hand, it might be something that they can complement their project with. There are a couple of interesting things in there that I wasn't entirely sure about. Lining the pond, Jenny mentioned that you could use old carpet and cardboard to line the pond before you put a liner in, which is a good idea. But the trouble with cardboard and carpet is that it rots. So that lining eventually will disappear. So if you did have anything particularly prickly underneath the liner, then chances are it might poke through after a while. So, you could use that, but I would use it in conjunction with a geotextile or something that isn't going to rot, something that isn't biodegradable or stay in the ground for ages. Definitely use sand. I mean, Jenny did say to use sand in there as well, but again, a sand is a sort of complement to the geotextile.
Yeah.
So
I suppose it also depends on the size of it. It's not too big a deal if you put your carpet underneath a tiny pond to reline it or whatever.
Right,
but if it's a substantial pond,
it's a substantial pond, you've got to get in it to clean it out, for instance. Then it needs to be really well protected.
Jenny is an interesting author. She's been here and given chats around our garden on the wildlife that's in it, and she does RHS talks as well. Right. So she's quite well known in the world of wildlife gardening and writing. She writes for various magazines, and I think you can see that in the book, really.
You can. She knows the stuff, obviously. Does she live quite locally as well?
She lives in Shropshire now. She did have a wildlife garden down in Oxford.
Right
in the middle of everywhere. you had this oasis of garden. But I think she got fed up of the noise.
The other thing I noticed in the book, it's exactly right what she says when she talks about creating ponds. She says, try not to create a pond with a saucer shape, because a big surface area, the water will get evaporated that much quicker, so it means topping it up more frequently in the summertime. But by contrast, if you're creating a wildlife pond in a school ground, for instance, then it's good to use a saucer shape, purely because if the kids fall in, then they can easily walk out again.
Yeah, and she talks about which sort of liner to use. To use concrete, didn't we, and stuff like that.
Yeah, old-fashioned. That was a kind of traditional way of really making a robust pond.
Yeah.
But of course, we've come to realise now that concrete has some real flaws, because it tends to crack. In fact, I've never known a pond made of concrete that doesn't crack eventually.
No.
Either through the natural shrinking process of concrete, but also because it freezes up in the winter and the ice will crack a pond as it expands.
Also, I mean, we followed this book when we made our pond here at Blakemere, and by using a liner, it means that you can have a completely natural shaped pond. It actually can look as if it may have just occurred.
Absolutely,
which,
you can. It just follows the contours of the land, doesn't it? A
Yeah.
butyle liner, it really does. It just kind of follows the contours of the ground, and then you can.
And she finishes off with a look at, well, she calls them bog gardens. I can't stand that word, so we call them marshes at Wiggly's.
Yeah.
Bog gardens.
Sounds better, darling.
Horrible, isn't it? But it goes quite alongside the pond quite nicely if you use the overflow to make the marsh, so the lower ground.
Yep.
Because that means that if there's an overflow from the pond, it goes into the marsh. But actually just spike a few holes in the bottom of the butyl of your marsh and fill it back up to the surface. The only thing is, you have to be careful that it doesn't dry out for massive periods of time. Although Rob, our wildflower guy, says that months through the summer it can be completely dry and those plants survive without a problem.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's Wildlife Ponds by Jenny Steele, and it's available all over the place, and it's £3.75. Plant of the week, Rich.
Yeah.
We're joined by Alison. Hello, Alison.
Hello.
Alison grows all our wildflower plants and also our hedging plants over at Buns Hill.
Yeah, that's right, not too far away.
Just over the river.
Only across the River Wye.
So, tell us about your farm, Al.
Well, the hedging plants are grown on 3.5 acres, which doesn't sound very much at all.
No, it doesn't.
But you can actually fit a sort of 6,000 to 10,000 little plants in 50 metres.
Wow.
So it's all very productive. And they're all supplied as 2-year-old bare roots plants, which Wigglers produce.
And the rest of the farm, you've got some amazing sheep, haven't you?
Oh yes, the new Zwarbless. Well, it's pronounced Zwarbless, but it's spelled Zwartbless. Some people call them Zwarbles, some people call them Zwarbless. I think it's got a silent T to be correct.
Yeah. But they're chocolate sheep, aren't they?
They're chocolate sheep.
Oh,
and
they're
they've got
lovely.
a brown stripe down their faces and a little white tip on their tails. And they're adorable and they're quite friendly too.
And there's not many people that breed them, is there?
No, I was number 89 breeder in the country. Now they've got over 200 in the society over the last 5 years that I was a member. They've had their 10th anniversary this year. There's what best sheep in the country. So,
Ooh.
it's quite exciting.
So
it is
what are they good for? Just being chocolate?
They're very milky and they're bred for meat as well. They're very good mothers.
They're pretty big, aren't they?
Yeah, the rams are quite a size, yes.
Anyway, what was it? Plant of the week. That was it.
Yeah. What sort of... Alison's a fantastic expert at most native species of plants.
Yeah, what have you brought us in there then, Al?
I brought in the spindle.
Has
an amazing berry in the autumn. It's bright pink with a vivid orange seed inside. It really is a fantastic hedgerow plant. I mean, there can't be another plant that is as vibrant coloured as a spindle.
Do birds feed on those seeds?
Yeah, the robins quite like the seeds.
They match the robin's breast, don't they?
They do.
Because you've got this bright orange.
I mean, they really are bright colours.
They look like sweeties.
Yeah,
you could eat them, actually.
Yeah.
They've got
Fantastic.
a texture, sort of
Could you
shiny.
eat them? Could human beings eat them?
They are poisonous.
No.
But not to a robin, hopefully.
No, hopefully not. But it's such a gorgeous plant to grow in the hedge.
Looking at it now, it's a lovely looking thing.
And you were saying to me, Al, that, even if you'd got a tiny garden, if you had just a few of these,
yeah,
they
just
actually
3 or 4.
And where did you see them?
I saw them down when I was on holiday down in Devon on an estate down there, and they've just grown 3 or 4 together on the banks in their garden, and it was a massive berries. It was just the most fantastic thing you could ever wish to imagine. And it's just a normal Euronymous europaeus, just normal native spindle. So
how old do they have to be before they fruit?
3 or 4. But I mean, even if you're riding out in the countryside on your horse or driving along, you're bound to spot a spindle. You cannot not spot it. It's just such a vibrant colour.
Yeah, and yet when you brought this into our office, everyone said, "What's that?"
I know.
It's not that common a plant.
It isn't, no. But when people do grow it, they think it's absolutely amazing.
How big does it grow to?
About between 8 and 10 foot. It's not over.
Is that how tall it is or how fat it is?
How tall it is.
And how fat is it?
6-7 foot. It grows sort of quite straggly on its own if just planted as a tree.
Yeah.
If cut back to a hedge, it grows up in the hedge with the other plants. On its own, it's quite a loner and it's quite delicate as well. It breaks easily. But growing in a clump of 3 or 4 just on its own is absolutely fine. It produces a perfect example of what it is.
So what about looking after it? Because once it's part of a hedge, that's fair enough. You just trim the hedge, every year?
Yeah, once a year, just trim it back in the autumn.
But if you're going to grow a clump of 3 or 4 of these, well, actually you always plant in odds, don't you? So we'll have to have a clump of 3 or 5.
Right.
But if you've got a clump of those, what do you do with it then?
Well, you just trim it back to whatever you want, really, for it to grow. I mean, there aren't any wrongs or right of pruning back a hedge or plants.
Really?
Yeah, you grow them to what you want, however high you like them. And there are specifications in all books and things, but you grow to whatever. I mean, if you want it more bushy, you just trim it back lower in the first few years.
Yeah.
If you want it to grow higher, then you just let it grow out a bit and perhaps trim the sides up.
So tell us how to buy this. How does it come? Buy it in a pot, I suppose, in the summer, but usually people want to plant this in the winter, don't they? So what happens and how would you plant it if you were going to plant this spindle out?
Well, it's best to plant it as a bare root plant. They're planted from November to March in the dormant stages.
So to me that means the plant comes without a pot.
It comes out of pot, it's bare roots, the roots should always remain moist, and it just looks basically like a stick with a few branches on, which in the winter people think, oh my god, it's dead.
Boring.
It's dead and boring, which it does look very boring. But in the spring, people are amazed and they ring up and they're so chuffed with their newly planted hedge. As long as you keep the roots moist, that's the most important thing about bare root hedging.
Right.
If they dry out at any stage, people don't understand this, that it will die and they won't realise it's dead until the spring.
Yeah, I
That's
see.
interesting.
It's very important. Yeah.
And there's a point in time where you mustn't plant bare roots anymore.
Yeah, when they start growing, sort of around Easter time.
Alison's very definite about this. Oh, the time is coming when we can't do it. And so when is it?
Approximately end of March, sort of Easter time it always clicks in.
And so when the sap rises?
When the sap rises.
So can you plant these right the way across the UK?
They're fine. Well, mainly they've always said that spindle grows in chalky conditions, but they are found all over the British Isles. They have a fantastic fibrous root compared with some of the other hedge plants. It's like dogwood, they have fibrous roots as well, which they can adapt to most soil types with that root. Yeah.
Well, brilliant. Okay.
Well, thank you for bringing it in.
Thank you.
It is one of the most beautiful berries I've
It is absolutely
seen.
astonishing, yeah.
It
really
almost
pretty.
looks, as I said, like a piece of candy.
Yeah, it does. You could eat those berries.
Anyway, Al, we'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
It's time for Monty with his Wormcast.
The Wiggly Wormcast podcast by Monty, a weekly fact on worms. There are approximately 2,700 different kinds of earthworms all over the world, and 27 of them live in the UK.
So that's the end of the Wiggly Podcast for this week.
It is. It's been a really interesting session. We've talked about some really detailed topics, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think also if anyone wants to contact us and give some feedback on the show or topics that we've spoken about, then they can email me at heather@wigglywigglers.co.uk, or you, Rich, at...
Richard@wigglywigglers.co.uk.
That's an original email
Yeah,
address.
absolutely, yeah.
Or you can click on Heather's blog from this podcast, or go to wigglywigglers.co.uk and click on it from there.
Great.
And put your comments in.
Good to get some feedback.
Yep. And so on the day that sadly Ronnie Barker died, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from her. Goodbye.
Goodbye.